What if reality isn't real? It sounds like science fiction, but the simulation hypothesis takes that idea seriously. Maybe we're not carbon-based creatures bumping around a physical universe, but digital processes running inside someone else's incredibly advanced computer. Every atom, every thought, every tiny decision could be lines of code. The world you touch, the grief you feel, the sense of choice you carry, all emergent behavior from a program written by someone or something we can't even imagine. Try picturing your life that way for a second. Not as a metaphor, not as a movie you sometimes forget you're watching, but as literal code. The warm weight of your phone in your hand, the sting of embarrassment, the quiet comfort of making dinner. What if each of those moments is the output of computations happening elsewhere? It's hard not to feel a little dizzy when you entertain it. For me, the image that sticks is not a giant control room full of glowing panels, but a single line of code that, when executed, makes my chest tighten with love or my stomach drop with regret. That line of code, running in real time, that feels alive, and that brings us to free will. The simulation view forces a brutal re-evaluation. If our brains are part of a program, are our choices genuinely ours, or are they determined by algorithms we didn't write? Maybe choosing to stay in a job, to forgive a friend, to walk away is just a branching calculation, complex, probabilistic, and indistinguishable from what we call choice. The suggestion that free will could be an illusion isn't just abstract philosophy. It lands on the everyday, the guilt you feel after an argument, the pride of finishing something hard, the moral responsibility you place on yourself. If those experiences are computed, do they lose value? Or is value independent of substrate? That a simulated joy is still joy to the one who experiences it. The truly unsettling part is not the possibility that we're fake. Plenty of art and films have played with fake worlds and loved ones who turn out to be illusions. What's unsettling here is epistemic. Even if we were in a simulation, we might never be able to tell. The creators could make their program perfect, intentionally hiding any telltale signs, or apparent glitches might be dismissed as quirks of physics or brain wiring. Every experiment we do to test the simulation could itself be accounted for by higher-level rules. We're stuck inside the system trying to examine the box that builds the box. That doesn't mean the idea is useless. It reframes questions we already ask. What makes life meaningful? How should we act if our choices feel scripted? For me, the takeaway is oddly practical. Whether we're code or cells, the experiences we have are the ones we remember, the relationships we build, the pains we endure. The simulation hypothesis can either be a paralyzing idea or a prompt to lean into what matters now. If we can't know the ultimate nature of reality, the next best thing is to be honest about how we live inside it, to act with care, curiosity, and courage. Next, we'll look at how people have tried to test this idea and what those attempts say about the limits of science and the persistence of wonder. Solipsism. Picture it this way. Everything you experience, every person you talk to, every street you walk down might be nothing more than contents of your own mind. Solipsism argues that only your mind is guaranteed to be real. Your friends, the world, even this sentence could exist only inside your awareness. I know how that sounds, like a late-night thought experiment that sneaks up on you after staring at your ceiling. But try to make it personal for a moment. Think about the last time you argued with someone, felt betrayed, or laughed until your stomach hurt. Now, entertain the tiny, chilling possibility that those responses were only happening inside you, that the person on the other end was not an independent being, but a pattern your mind constructed. It's a lonely idea that consciousness could be an endless mirror with no one else inside it. If solipsism were true, then every apology you ever received, every compliment, every difficult conversation, none of it would be an exchange between minds. You've never spoken to another real being, only to reflections of yourself. That realization, even as a hypothetical, can be disorienting. It pokes at the foundations of trust, ethics, and meaning. If other minds are illusions, do their feelings matter? Do their pain and joy have weight outside your own experience? There's a grim fascination to that question. On one hand, thinking this way can be intoxicatingly free. You bear responsibility only for your own experiences. On the other hand, it can feel unbearably isolating, like being the only actor on a very convincing stage. Imagine reaching for comfort after a hard day and realizing the hand that comforts you might be your own creation. The instinctive warmth of human connection suddenly looks like clever inner theatre. But solipsism also functions as a powerful mirror for self-awareness. Even if you reject it, the idea forces you to examine why you assume other minds are real. We rely on consistency, shared language, unpredictable behavior, and independent perspectives to infer other consciousnesses. The fact that people surprise us, that they contradict our expectations and sometimes refuse to conform to our wishes, provides strong, everyday evidence against solipsism. Still, it's telling how deeply we rely on assumptions that feel invisible until someone points them out. Whether you find solipsism terrifying, intriguing, or plainly implausible, it does one important thing. It makes relationship and empathy intentional. If you accept, for moral and practical reasons, that others are real, then each gesture, apology, and conversation becomes a deliberate act of reaching out. That choice matters more than the philosophical certainty behind it. So, would you rather live like the only real mind, or choose to connect as if others truly exist? Eternal recurrence. Think of Nietzsche's thought experiment as a mirror held up to your life. Imagine that every detail, choice, sorrow, and joy would play again, exactly as they did, and will keep playing forever. Not a rough replay, but the very same sequence. The spilled coffee, the apology you never gave, the doors you left unopened. That image can feel unbearable, like a punishment designed to make you squirm. But Nietzsche's point isn't cruelty, it's a test. He asks, could you love your life so completely that you'd will to live it, with all its faults, for eternity? It sounds extreme, of course, but that extremity is the point. It forces honest assessment. Here's how it works for ordinary life. Pick a scene. A repeated argument with a friend. The weekly grind you dread. The hesitation that cost you a relationship. Now imagine living that same scene forever. If your stomach knots, that's information. If you feel excited, curious, or strangely peaceful, that's also information. Either way, the thought makes choices feel weighty in a way they often don't in the moment. That gravity can be freeing because it helps you sort what you truly value from what you merely tolerate. It pushes you toward tiny, concrete changes. Say a hard truth, make time for someone, quit something that drains you. You begin to realize life isn't judged only by highs, it's judged by how you meet the small, repeated hours. And loving the life you have isn't passive acceptance. It's active work. It means choosing and re-choosing love, courage, kindness, and integrity in moments that often feel mundane. If that sounds heavy, remember, the test isn't to pretend pain doesn't matter, but to ask whether even the painful parts could be integrated into something you could affirm. One practical move is to imagine a single day repeating forever and then tweak it. What small change would make it bearable, even beautiful? Maybe you start journaling on the commute, or call your mother at lunch, or finally speak honestly in that meeting. You don't have to overhaul your life overnight. You just have to make intentional choices that move you toward an answer you'd be willing to repeat. Maybe you fail sometimes. Maybe you repeat mistakes. Eternal recurrence does not demand perfection. It asks for affirmation. The aim is to craft a life you'd greet with a full-bodied yes, even when you remember the hard parts. So, next time you're stuck in a rut or can't stop fretting about some choice, try the recurrence test. Picture living what you'll do next week for eternity. And ask, would I will that? If not, What small step shifts it toward a yes? The test can feel radical because it strips away excuses like later and someday. You see how much of life you're postponing. And there's an odd liberation in that clarity. When you know what you would or wouldn't will eternally, you gain leverage to change. Nietzsche gives us a brutal litmus, not to trap us in fatalism, but to invite us into fierce ownership. If you can say yes, flaws and all, you've passed the test. Determinism. Picture the universe as a line of perfectly spaced dominoes stretching back to the Big Bang. Each tile knocks over the next. Galaxies form, stars die, planets spin into place, life emerges, your parents meet, you're born, and every thought you have after that is just the next tile falling. That's the basic image people mean when they talk about determinism. Every mental state, every decision, every feeling is the inevitable result of prior causes. That idea hits a weird place inside us. On the one hand, it's strangely elegant. There's an order to everything, a neat causal chain that connects the smallest quantum fluctuation to the choices you make. On the other hand, it's unsettling. If everything is determined, then the sense that I could have done otherwise starts to feel like an illusion. Even the belief that you have free will would itself be part of the chain, a thought produced by prior brain states and environmental inputs, not a spontaneously self-generated act of authorship. Let's bring it closer to home. Think about a time you swore you chose freely, maybe deciding to quit a job, break up with someone, or even yelling at a driver who cut you off. If determinism is true, your decision in that moment was the result of long histories. Your past experiences, your genetics, the way your brain was wired by childhood, what you ate that morning, how much sleep you'd had, and countless causal events stretching back further than you can imagine. That doesn't make your feeling real. It just reframes its origin. There are two very human reactions to this. One is liberation. If your actions are the consequence of causes beyond your control, maybe that eases some burden of guilt. How harsh should we be on someone whose choices are part of a chain they didn't author? The other reaction is horror, loss of responsibility, loss of meaning. If you didn't freely choose your values, can those values still be yours? If your anger, your love, your moral judgments are canalized by history, what does that do to praise and blame? Here's another way to feel it. Imagine replaying the universe, not hypothetically, but in your head. If we could run the same conditions again, same atoms, same history up to this second, would you always make the same choices? Determinism says yes. It says that your confidence, doubts, and even this sentence you're hearing now are already written into that replay. That's why the determinist's message stings. It forces us to examine the basis of responsibility and to reckon with how much of who we are is shaped rather than chosen. But it also opens a doorway to asking what kind of moral and social systems best fit a world where I is more effect than origin. We'll look at those consequences next and ask whether acknowledging determinism requires us to change how we judge, punish, and forgive. The Ship of Theseus. Now think about a wooden ship slowly, plank by plank, being replaced. The sailors keep it afloat. The name stays painted on the bow, but eventually, not a single original plank remains. Is that still the same ship? That's the Ship of Theseus, and it forces a question that hits closer to home than a museum exhibit. If every part of you is replaced over time, are you still you? Start with something simple and relatable. Your skin sloughs off, your blood renews, you get new molecules every few years. Most of what makes up your body now wasn't here 10 or even 5 years ago. Then think about the less visible stuff. Memories fade. Opinions shift, tastes change. Maybe you once loved a band you now find embarrassing, or you used to be terrified of dogs and now can't imagine that fear. If you flipped a switch and replaced every cell in your body and rewired every memory, would that person still be you? There are two ways people usually answer this. One says identity is all about parts, the composition. If the atoms, cells, or components change, the thing is different. The other says identity is about continuity, patterns, histories, and connections over time. You have a continuous story. Even if the pages are new ink, the narrative threads tie you to who you were. The uncomfortable part is realizing you're already halfway through that thought experiment. You literally aren't the same person you were 10 years ago. Your priorities, hobbies, even the way you react to stress have evolved. And yet you still point to yourself in the mirror and say, me. How does that feel? Strange, comforting, unsettling? For many of us, it's both. We cling to certain memories, names, relationships, the anchors that make us feel like a single, ongoing self. There's a practical twist. Memory matters. If you remember being you, you tend to accept continuity. But if you lost those memories through trauma, disease, or an extreme brain reset, would the legal you, the social you, the emotional you still be the same? Imagine waking up without 5 years of memories. Your friends insist you're the same, but your laughter, your grief, your private jokes feel foreign. That gap makes the abstract puzzle intensely real. And then there's the narrative idea. Identity as a story we tell about ourselves. We stitch together events, choices, and traits into a coherent tale. This explains why two people made of exactly the same parts could be different if their life narratives diverge. It also explains why we forgive ourselves for change, because our story continues even when chapters turn sharply. So what matters more to you? The material bits that make you up, or the thread that links who you used to be with who you are now? Take a second and picture a vivid memory from childhood. Now notice how you feel about that child. Do they seem like you, a stranger, or a younger version of you? That gut answer reveals which side of the Theseus puzzle you lean toward, and maybe why the question keeps nudging us. Identity isn't just about parts or patterns, it's about how we live the space between them. The brain in a vat. Picture this: a lab, a glass tank humming gently, and your brain, floating, alive, wired to a machine that feeds you an unbroken stream of perfect experiences. When you wake in that simulation, you feel the warmth of sunlight on your face, the smell of coffee, the push of your feet on pavement. You laugh with friends, you ache after a long day, you fall asleep and dream. Everything continuous, everything coherent. If someone whispered the truth into your ear, how would you know they weren't lying? Start with the small stuff. That first sip of coffee, the tiny scolding that makes you grimace and then smile. Does that make the experience any less real if it's generated by code? Most of us build our lives from these micro moments. The bite of toast, a child's sticky hand, the sting of embarrassment. If every single one of those sensations could be mimicked perfectly, it's hard not to feel unmoored. I find myself testing the edges of my own conviction by remembering times when a smell pulled me back to a place I thought I'd forgotten. Were those memories a safeguard, or just another series of well-crafted inputs? Practicality doesn't help much here. You think, okay, I'd notice inconsistencies. But our brains are astonishing pattern completion machines. They patch holes, smooth seams, and make sense of noise. A simulation that knows how our minds stitch together experience could be designed to anticipate and correct the places we'd look for flaws. The very strategies we use to verify reality, comparison, repetition, cross-checking, could be accounted for by an adversarial intelligence. That's unnerving because the tests we trust are the same ones the simulation expects us to trust. Then there's trust in other people. We anchor our beliefs not just in our senses, but in shared testimony, the looks on faces, the stories friends tell, the way communities keep each other accountable. If every person I meet is part of the illusion or another simulated consciousness, testimony collapses. Betrayal and comfort both become fabrications. Suddenly, did you really do that? Becomes a question with no meaningful distinction between lie and generated signal. This is why skepticism here is corrosive. Once the possibility of being a brain in a vat enters your mind, it doesn't sit politely in a corner. It starts to reframe every interaction. Sunrises could be signals. Pain could be code executed to teach you. Happiness could be a subroutine. And with that tenth of a second's doubt, reality loses its automatic trustworthiness. So where do we go from here? The tough, almost comforting answer is, we go on. Even if we can't prove we're not brains in tanks, the cadence of our lives, caring for others, making plans, feeling love, still matters to us. Whether those things are produced by neurons in skulls or by circuits in a vat, the felt importance of them shapes how we act. That's not philosophical defeatism. It's a practical stance. You can't spend your whole life verifying whether the coffee is real. You have to live as if it is, because living is the thing that gives even a possible illusion its meaning. The problem of evil. Think about the last time something unfair happened to you. Not a philosophical puzzle, but a gut-level thing. A loved one gets sick, a job falls through, a storm wipes out a neighborhood. In those moments, the question that philosophers have been arguing about for millennia isn't abstract anymore. It's raw and personal. If there's a God who's all-powerful and all-good, why is this happening to me? Why to them? This is the problem of evil in its most human form. It forces belief to look at itself like a mirror. For some people, that mirror reflects hope, a sense that suffering has meaning or that a greater plan exists. For others, it reflects horror. How could a loving, omnipotent being allow such pain? Neither reaction is just intellectual. Both are emotional, and both shape how people live. Philosophers and theologians offer a few common answers. One is the free will defense. Suffering is the price of freedom. If God wants creatures who can love genuinely, they must be able to choose badly as well as well. That explains moral evil, the harms caused by people. But what about earthquakes, cancers, the suffering of a toddler who has never had a moral choice? That's where other answers come in. Some appeal to soul-making, the idea that trials shape character. Suffering, in this view, can mature empathy, courage, and depth. It sounds reasonable until you find yourself consoling someone who lost a child, and the phrase, "it builds character," feels hollow. There's also the test idea. Life is an exam, and this suffering is part of the grading. For believers, that can provide a framework. For many, it feels like an excuse that fails to account for scale and randomness. Then there's skeptical theism, which basically says our human minds aren't equipped to see God's reasons. Maybe there's a good explanation, but we're too limited to know it. That can be comforting, but it can also feel unsatisfying. Like being told to trust a plot twist you can't even imagine. On the other side, some see suffering as evidence against God's existence. The sheer quantity and cruelty of evil, gratuitous, pointless pain, seems incompatible with a benevolent omnipotence. That's not a moral failing of faith as much as an honest grappling. If you look at a catastrophe and feel anger toward the idea of a God who could stop it but didn't, that anger is philosophically valid. What makes this topic so wrenching is that all these positions have something right and something lacking. Free will captures an important fact about human agency but struggles with natural evil. Soul-making recognizes growth but risks minimizing real harm. Skeptical theism defends God's inscrutability but can feel evasive. And the atheistic critique is powerful but must answer why moral intuition points toward goodness at all. So the problem of evil isn't just a logical puzzle. It's a mirror held up to individual faith and experience. How you answer it often depends on whether your mirror reflects hope, pain, doubt, or a mix of all three. And that personal reflection shapes not only belief, but how we respond to suffering in the world. Existential nihilism is the blunt, unsettling claim that life has no inherent meaning, purpose, or value. At first, it reads like a theory, a cold philosophical statement. But the moment it lands emotionally, it feels like a small earthquake. I remember the first time I really let that idea sit with me. I was sitting on a late-night walk, thinking about goals and the future, and a weird clarity came in. The trophies, the approved posts, the career ladder, What if none of it mattered in any cosmic sense? What if meaning was something we'd been taught to pretend was real? That's the heart of it. Actions, morals, the stories we tell about why we do what we do. They're human inventions. They're useful, stabilizing, communal. They help us get up in the morning and treat each other decently. But under existential nihilism, those inventions are not anchored to any objective meaning out in the universe. They're temporary comforts we build to function in an indifferent world. And this is where it gets messy. The disturbing part isn't simply that meaning might be made up, it's how disorienting it feels to recognize the illusion. Once you've pulled back the curtain, once you've seen that the script might be a script, it's surprisingly hard to put it back on and believe in it with the same conviction. The rituals that used to feel comforting can look performative. The moral rules you grew up with can feel arbitrary. Suddenly the routines that scaffolded your days look like props on a stage, and you're left wondering whether the performance still matters. That sensation can bring a real ache, even panic. You might feel unmoored, like your compass has lost its needle. It's why people sometimes describe nihilism as a form of existential vertigo. The ground that felt solid is suddenly gone. I felt that too. A kind of emotional hollowness that makes even small choices heavy because they seem so final in a world that doesn't care. And yet, and this is important, some people find a strange freedom in that emptiness. If there is no pre-written purpose, then meaning becomes something you can create rather than discover. That realization can be terrifying and liberating at the same time. Without a cosmic handbook telling you what to value, you get to decide what matters to you. That could be making art that delights you, choosing relationships that sustain you, or committing to causes you care about because they feel right to you, not because they were handed down as sacred. I won't pretend it's simple. Rebuilding meaning after the curtain falls is a slow, intentional process. It involves experimenting with small commitments, noticing what actually brings you a sense of worth, and being honest about the comforts you're clinging to. For some, that rebuilding never mimics the old certainty, and that's okay. The point isn't to fake conviction, but to find practices and connections that make life feel livable and chosen. So existential nihilism can be a void or a blank page. Which one it becomes often depends on how we respond, with paralysis or with the hard creative work of inventing meaning that feels authentic to us. The Trolley Problem is a little story that hits like a gut punch. Picture this, a runaway trolley hurtling toward 5 people who are stuck on the track. You're standing beside a lever that can divert the trolley onto another track. But there's one person tied there. Do you pull the lever? Most people answer yes. Now swap the lever for a footbridge and imagine you could push a large stranger off the bridge to stop the trolley and save the 5. Suddenly, a lot of those same people hesitate. What's happening in that pause is worth paying attention to. On one side is a kind of moral arithmetic, lives compared like numbers. Save 5, lose 1, net benefit. That's utilitarian thinking in its simplest form. It reduces the choice to outcomes and totals. On the other side are rules that feel inviolable. Don't actively harm another person, even to prevent greater harm. That's deontological ethics, duties, rights, moral lines you don't cross. If you've ever felt uncomfortable answering the trolley questions, you're not failing at philosophy, you're experiencing the problem's point. Every choice seems wrong because the thought experiment exposes what morality costs to define. Pick by numbers and you risk becoming a teller of statistics instead of a knower of people. Refuse to act and you live with the knowledge that inaction allowed avoidable suffering. Both options make you responsible in different ways. Make it personal for a moment. Imagine you're a doctor in an overwhelmed emergency room, the last ventilator and 2 patients who might live with it. Or imagine being a parent in a thunderstorm, deciding whether to risk a rescue attempt that could endanger you but save your child. Those aren't neat philosophical puzzles. They're messy, charged, full of faces and histories. The trolley problem helps by stripping away the context and forcing you to see the raw conflict between consequence and principle, but it can never capture the full moral weight of real-world relationships. There's also an emotional truth here. Proximity changes judgment. People are more reluctant to physically push someone than to pull a remote lever, even when outcomes match. That reveals how empathy, disgust, and social norms shape moral intuition. Ethics isn't purely numbers, nor is it purely feeling. It's an interplay between reasoned calculation, personal bonds, and the stories we tell ourselves about what kind of people we want to be. So why does every answer feel wrong? Because the trolley problem is less about finding the single correct act and more about revealing what you value and what you will accept to uphold it. The cost of defining morality is the loss of certainty. When you next face a real moral choice, notice the parts that make you flinch. That flinch is a clue. It tells you which principles matter most to you and what kind of moral compromise you are, or aren't, willing to live with. The paradox of tolerance. Think about a dinner party where one person keeps amplifying hateful jokes. At first, everyone laughs nervously, then someone asks them to stop. They insist it's just free speech, and the host, wanting to be polite, lets it slide. By the end of the night, half the guests are offended, and a friendship is broken. That small real-life scene is a microcosm of the paradox of tolerance. Philosopher Karl Popper put it bluntly: unlimited tolerance can lead to the end of tolerance. If a society tolerates movements that openly aim to abolish freedom, eventually those movements will use the liberties granted to them to destroy those liberties for everyone. It's not an abstract academic point. It's a pattern you can spot in history, politics, workplaces, and even online communities. This idea makes people uncomfortable because it asks us to limit something we usually treat as an unquestionable good. We're taught that freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to believe are core values, and they are. But when we treat them as absolute, immune to context or consequence, we hand tools of destruction to those who would use them against the very freedoms that protect us. It helps to separate speech from action. Allowing someone to express an unpopular opinion is very different from allowing coordinated violence, intimidation, or systematic exclusion that shuts others out. The paradox isn't a call to silence dissent, it's a warning that tolerating intolerant actions, the kind that aim to crush pluralism and equal rights, is self-defeating. This becomes personal fast. Maybe you've stayed silent in a group chat because calling out toxic behavior felt like censorship. Or maybe you've defended a friend's offensive comment in the name of letting them speak, only to watch how that defense hurt others. Those small choices add up. When institutions and communities refuse to push back, intolerance gains safe spaces to grow. So what does protection look like in practice? It's not an all-you-can-ban list. It's rules that distinguish expression from harm, and consistent enforcement so limits aren't arbitrary. It's norms that say, yes, speak your truth, but don't use that truth to erase someone else's right to exist or to participate. It's the awkward conversations, the policies that some will call overreach, and the moral courage to prioritize long-term liberty over short-term comfort. Understanding the paradox of tolerance means accepting that some freedoms must be constrained to keep the larger freedom intact. That tension is messy, but it's also necessary. Next, we'll look at how societies and communities can draw those lines fairly, without slipping into censorship or capitulation. The Omnipotence Paradox. So let's try a thought experiment that looks almost silly on the surface, but actually punches a hole in the whole idea of absolute power. Imagine someone tells you about an all-powerful being, literally capable of doing anything. Then ask, can that being create a rock so heavy that even it cannot lift it? If the answer is yes, that being has made something it cannot lift, which means it's not all-powerful. If the answer is no, that being cannot create such a rock, which again means it's not all-powerful. Either way, the title, all-powerful, collapses. I remember the first time I ran into this question. I was a teenager, arguing on an internet forum, half serious, half showing off. The paradox felt like a magic trick gone wrong. You think you've got an unstoppable concept, and then the concept defeats itself. It's oddly personal because it forces you to examine the words you use. When I call something perfect or all-powerful, am I just bluffing with language? There are a couple ways people try to respond. One is to say the question is meaningless. It's like asking, can a square be round? The idea is, if all-powerful includes doing the logically impossible, then the problem is asking for nonsense. But that answer is uncomfortable because it changes the original claim. If all-powerful is only allowed to do logically possible things, then we've already put a limit on it. We've softened the absolute. Another reaction is to treat the paradox as a demonstration that our language or imagination can produce contradictions that don't actually exist in the world. That's tidier, but colder. It removes the existential sting. The more unsettling conclusion is the one I keep circling back to. Maybe perfection, true, absolute perfection, is a concept that can't exist coherently. If perfection requires being free of any limits, but the very notion of free of limits leads to contradictions, then perhaps perfection isn't just rare, it's impossible. Think about that for a second. We often use perfect in everyday life. A perfect cup of coffee, the perfect sunset, the perfect plan. Those are human, warm, achievable glimpses of what perfection might feel like. The idea that ultimate perfection, the kind that never fails, never contradicts, never surprises, could be logically incoherent, feels like stepping off a cliff. It's not just that a godlike being might be limited, it's that the label godlike might be a linguistic dead end. That's the deeper horror. It forces humility into our metaphysical fantasies. We have to admit that some ideals, when pushed to their extreme, implode. And that admission changes how we think about power, responsibility, and the meaning of ultimate. It's a small philosophical lesson with big emotional consequences. And it's one reason this goofy rock question still shows up in serious debates. Moral relativism. Think about the last time you felt certain you were doing the right thing. Maybe you intervened in a fight, or you refused to cheat on a test, or you judged someone for something they did. Now imagine someone from another place or another era looking at that same moment and seeing something entirely different. That's the core of moral relativism. The idea that right and wrong aren't fixed truths waiting to be discovered, but social products shaped by culture, history, and personal perspective. I remember traveling with a friend to a country where greeting customs included a level of physical closeness that felt uncomfortable at first. Back home, I would have called it intrusive. There, it was polite, respectful, even necessary to maintain social bonds. At the time, I felt uneasy. Then I felt silly for feeling uneasy. Neither reaction was more true than the other. They were shaped by different backgrounds and expectations. Scale that up from greetings to practices like arranged marriage, dietary laws, or attitudes toward authority, and you start to see how many of our moral instincts are stitched into a particular social fabric. If morality really does depend on culture and time, then maybe nothing is inherently right or wrong, only common or uncommon. That makes every act of good or evil a kind of perspective. Slavery was widely accepted in many civilizations for centuries. Abolitionists were radicals. Sexual norms that were criminalized a generation ago are normalized today. And laws we think of as moral achievements, women's suffrage, civil rights, were once outrageous. The unsettling implication is that our moral certainties might not be discovered truths, but agreements we've made with one another. That idea is both liberating and terrifying. On the one hand, moral relativism encourages humility. It invites us to ask why we believe what we do, to listen to other viewpoints, and to avoid assuming our customs are the moral gold standard. It can be a tool for empathy. recognizing that someone who seems wrong might simply be following a different set of rules. On the other hand, if there's no objective standard, how do we criticize injustice? If morality is just consensus, condemning genocide or human trafficking becomes complicated. Are we just imposing our standard on another group? There's a practical side too. Civilization depends on shared agreements. We all drive on the same side of the road. We adopt common currencies and laws, and we agree on certain basic rights. Those are moral and practical pacts that allow complex societies to function. The chilling thought is that those pacts are not anchored in universal truth, but in collective choice. That doesn't make them worthless. Agreements can be incredibly stable and life-saving, but it does force us to confront the fragility of the moral ground beneath our feet. So where does that leave us as individuals? Maybe it means holding our convictions lightly, remaining willing to revise them, and working consciously to build agreements that protect the vulnerable. Or maybe it means accepting a kind of pluralism, where multiple moral systems coexist uneasily. Either way, moral relativism pulls the rug on certainty and asks us to decide what we owe to each other when there's no absolute moral map. Pascal's wager. Think about the little bets you make all day without calling them bets. You buckle your seatbelt not because you expect a crash, but because the cost is tiny and the upside is safety. You buy travel insurance for a big trip because losing a week's pay would hurt. Pascal invited us to treat belief in God the same way, not as the result of mystical revelation, but as a pragmatic choice. Here's the core idea in plain terms. Imagine two possibilities: God exists or God doesn't. If you choose to believe and you're right, you gain essentially everything: eternal life, infinite joy. If you choose to believe and you're wrong, Pascal says your loss is small: some time in church, a few rituals, maybe a different way of living. If you choose not to believe and God exists, you risk losing everything. So, on expected value grounds, belief looks like the safer bet. Pascal's point isn't that belief becomes intellectually proven. It's that when the stakes are infinite, rational self-interest recommends belief. Now be honest with yourself for a second. Isn't there something unsettling about that? It implies you might believe because it's strategically smart, not because you're convinced. That changes the texture of faith. Instead of a quiet conviction that rearranges your sense of meaning, belief can become transactional, a hedge against cosmic ruin. For a lot of people, that feels like drinking coffee for the warmth rather than the taste. It works, but it's not the same as actually loving coffee. This pragmatic model has a very human face. I remember a conversation with a friend who grew up atheist but started attending services in his 20s just in case. He described feeling hypocritical at first, like he was dressing up in someone else's life. But over time, some of the rituals began to matter to him. That's Pascal's subtle suggestion too. Practicing the behaviors could, in some cases, foster genuine belief. But that's also the tricky part. Are you okay with starting from a calculated wager and hoping authenticity follows? There's also a moral discomfort. Do you want to base your deepest commitments on self-interest? Is it honest to cultivate belief primarily to avoid loss? For many, a faith rooted in fear of loss feels shallow. And for others, it's a perfectly reasonable survival strategy. The wager forces us to confront what we value more: certainty of truth or prudence against catastrophe. So Pascal gives us a clear, uncomfortable choice framed as a bet. The question that follows isn't just, is it rational? It's, what kind of person do you want to be while making that bet? The paradox of choice. This leads us to one of the strangest truths about freedom. Choice can make us miserable. We all say we want options: more jobs, more dates, more apps, more ways to spend a Saturday. But when every decision feels permanent, it becomes a burden. I remember standing in a grocery aisle, staring at 10 types of cereal, suddenly sweating over which one would make my morning better. Later I realized the stress wasn't about cereal. It was about the idea that choosing wrong might close off some invisible better future. Psychologists call this the paradox of choice, Beyond a certain point, more options don't boost happiness. They increase anxiety, second-guessing, and the fear of someday regretting the path not taken. It turns decision-making into a performance. We audition every option for a life we're trying to optimize. Some people cope by becoming maximizers. They search for the absolute best. Others are satisficers. They pick the first option that's good enough. Maximizers might buy the dream TV, but then dwell on features they missed. Satisficers often feel content, even if their choice could technically be improved. Neither approach is morally superior, but knowing your tendency helps. If you're a maximizer, set limits. If you're a satisficer, occasionally challenge your standards. The paradox doesn't mean choices are bad. It means unlimited choice without structure invites doubt. Structure, like deadlines, budgets, or preset filters, turns freedom into manageable choice. When I limit options, I set a 5-minute timer or choose 2 apps to try. Decisions suddenly feel lighter. We trade endless possibility for clarity. And paradoxically, constraints feel like freedom. They free us from the burden of imagining every alternate life. Knowing this doesn't mean you should avoid choices. It means you can design how you choose so freedom stops feeling like a trap. Start with small rules. Unsubscribe from a few newsletters, narrow your streaming list, or pick a go-to meal. You'll be surprised how much lighter decisions feel when you're not trying to optimize every tiny choice. Regret plays a huge role. Every opened door highlights the others, and we imagine the better versions of ourselves waiting behind them. On dating apps, I've swiped past good people, wondering if the next swipe will reveal someone perfect, and the habit turned simple choices into a version of roulette. Advertising and infinite choice industries know this. They sell the fantasy of endless better options, so we'll keep returning to decide again. Recognizing the trap helped me be kinder to myself. I stopped pretending every choice had to be the definitive upgrade. If you notice the same pattern, try one small experiment. Limit options in one area this week and notice how your mood around choices changes. Next, we'll see how comparing ourselves to others deepens the anxiety around choice and practical ways to reclaim calm. I'll share steps you can try. Fatalism says that no matter what you do, the story is already written. Effort, hope, even the choices that feel most consequential, they don't change the outcome. Picture a river. You can paddle, you can splash, you can scream at the current, but the water will keep carrying you toward the same bend. For some people, that image is freeing. For others, it's terrifying. I remember a time I missed an important job interview because my train was delayed. For hours, I rage texted, recalculated routes, begged a ride, convinced myself that if I just hustled harder, I could still make it. In the end, the interview happened without me. For a while, I clung to the idea that something larger had been at work. Maybe it wasn't meant to be. That thought soothed me. It removed the sting of failure. But it also left a weird hollow. If fate decided that day, what does it mean that I tried so hard in the first place? That tension is at the heart of fatalism. On one side, surrender. There's comfort in releasing responsibility when life feels overwhelming. A friend of mine who lives with chronic illness describes it as trading a constant, exhausting war with the world for a quieter acceptance. If the disease has its own course, she told me, she can stop punishing herself for not being able to control it. That peace is real, and for many people, it's a lifeline. On the other side, there's the moral and existential problem. If actions don't matter, why strive to be kind? Why keep promises? If every outcome is fixed, accountability becomes an empty word. I've seen relationships fray when one person leans on fatalism as an excuse. I couldn't help it. It was meant to be. And the other feels abandoned. Suddenly, the shared project of caring for each other collapses under the claim that nothing either of you does can alter the script. Fatalism also changes how we grieve. If everything is predetermined, loss can feel oddly less personal, like a scene written by some impersonal author. That can ease pain for some, but for others it strips away the sense that their loved one mattered because of the specific actions and choices they made. Meaning becomes abstract instead of rooted in lived moments. So what do we do with this idea? Some people use fatalism as a balm. It reduces anxiety about outcomes, helps them focus on the present rather than on controlling the uncontrollable. Others treat it as a challenge, not to deny fate, but to create meaning inside it. Maybe the river flows the same way, but you can still choose how you float, with bitterness, with curiosity, with kindness. You may not change the bend, but you can change how you meet it. Think about the last time you felt powerless. Did you find relief in surrender, or did it feel like a loss of agency? There's no single right answer, but recognizing which way you lean helps you decide how to act, whether that means accepting what you can't change, or doubling down on the values that give your life shape, even in a world that might feel already decided. Mereological Nihilism. Think about the chair you're sitting on. You call it my chair. You feel the seat under you, maybe a familiar squeak when you shift. Mereological Nihilism says none of that is what you think. There aren't real chairs, just fundamental bits of stuff, particles, arranged in chair-shaped patterns for a little while. The same goes for your hand, your phone, your whole city. They're all temporary arrangements of parts, and the boundaries you point to are conveniences, not metaphysical facts. That sounds like someone smiling while quietly moving your furniture, but it's not meant to be malicious. At the microscopic level, this is just plain physics. Matter is mostly empty space with a storm of electrons and nuclei. What counts as a thing is a pattern that holds together long enough for us to notice and name it. So, the nihilist's blunt slogan, "There are no composite objects," simply says the only true things are the fundamental bits and the patterns they form. Now let's make it personal. When I say you aren't a person, you're a pattern pretending to be one, I know it hits close to home. Touch your hand. The warmth, the scars, the memory of that handshake 2 years ago. These are all features of a complex, ongoing pattern. Molecules, cells, neural firings, habits. Over time, your body replaces many of its atoms. The continuity you call me isn't guaranteed by stubbornly clinging atoms. It's held together by a dynamic pattern that persists long enough to create a narrative identity that has strange ethical and emotional consequences. If you're a pattern, what does survival mean? Nihilists tend to define persistence in degrees. As long as the pattern remains sufficiently similar across time, you continue. Radical disruptions, catastrophic brain damage, for example, aren't just losses of property. They are literal ends of a pattern. It's an uncomfortable way to think about death, but it's also oddly precise. And what about responsibility? If people are patterns, responsibility becomes a story about causal chains. Patterns you create or reinforce that affect other patterns. That doesn't erase blame, praise, love, or grief. Patterns hurt other patterns. Suffering still matters because it's a disruption of processes we care about. Try a quick mental image, a sandcastle on the beach. For a while, it's a castle. Waves and kids come, and eventually its grains scattered again. Saying the castle existed wasn't wrong in everyday speech, but ontologically, the castle was a transient configuration of sand. Replace the sand with neurons and you get the same lesson applied to you. So how should you live with this idea? You don't need to dissolve into nihilism. Think of it as a change in perspective. Objects and selves become useful shorthand for stable, meaningful patterns. This can be liberating, less attachment to things and to rigid notions of identity, and grounding because it reminds you that the relationships and processes you contribute to are what actually persist. The chair, the city, the self, they're all part of a vibrant choreography of parts. Once you see the dance, it's hard to look at the world the same way. The experience machine. Think about Robert Nozick's experience machine for a second. a device that plugs you into any life you want. Endless pleasure, constant success, relationships that feel perfect. Once you're in, you never know it's a simulation. Sounds amazing on paper, right? But when Nozick asked whether we'd choose to plug in, most people's hands hover over the switch and then stop. I know mine would. Why do we hesitate? At first it feels irrational. Who wouldn't trade a few rough mornings and awkward dates for uninterrupted joy? But that hesitation is the clue. It's not just about pleasure versus pain. It's about what we want our lives to be made of. For me, some of the clearest answers come from small, messy moments. Learning to play guitar was painful. Sore fingers, months of sounding terrible, and the embarrassment of playing in front of a friend. If I'd been offered instant mastery in exchange for those months, I might have said yes. But looking back, those bad practice sessions are exactly what I value. They remind me where I started and make the wins taste real. The pride after a hard-earned chord progression isn't just about the sound. It's about the stubbornness, the setbacks, and the ridiculous joy of getting through them. Nozick's thought experiment exposes something deeper. We don't only want pleasurable experiences, we want to be a certain kind of person who earns and shapes those experiences. Authenticity matters. Agency matters. If every moment of triumph is handed to you by a machine, is it really your triumph? There's an odd hollowness to victories that have no history, no struggle, no mistakes, no lessons learned. Relationships feel the same way. I wouldn't want the perfect partner pre-programmed for me because part of loving someone is watching them grow, arguing, forgiving, and choosing you again. The messy fight that leads to better understanding is as meaningful as the peaceful evenings. If every conversation was flawless, you'd lose the stories that make someone who they are. Pain and imperfection also act like signals. Physical pain warns us about danger. Emotional pain tells us we care and need to change. Without those signals, the world flattens. Struggle gives context to joy and shapes priorities. A life of uninterrupted bliss could be pleasant in the short term, but oddly empty in the long run. This doesn't mean we should romanticize suffering for its own sake. But Nozick forces us to ask, what kind of life do we actually want? One that's merely pleasurable, or one that contains meaning born from effort, error, and repair? The experience machine strips away agency and narrative. Our reluctance to plug in says we value those things more than pure bliss. So before you chase the easiest path to happiness, consider whether you're chasing pleasure or crafting a life. The next idea we'll explore takes that tension and asks, how do we balance seeking joy with embracing the struggles that make it meaningful? The Chinese room argument. Picture this. A man sits alone in a locked room. Under the door slide little slips of paper, each one full of Chinese characters. He doesn't speak a word of Chinese. All he has is an instruction manual, one of those thick rule books that tells him, symbol by symbol, which characters to write in response. He follows the rules perfectly. He shuffles papers, looks up the right symbols, writes them down, passes them out. To anyone outside, the replies look fluent. The people on the other side assume the man understands Chinese. That's the setup of John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment. And I'll be honest, the first time I heard it, I felt a knot in my brain. It's such a simple story, but it manages to poke a hole in the thing we casually assume about artificial intelligence. That if something behaves like it understands, then it must understand. What Searle asks us to focus on is the difference between manipulating symbols and understanding meaning. The man in the room is manipulating symbols according to formal rules. He's brilliant at following syntax, but does he grasp semantics, the meanings those symbols carry? Searle's point is that no matter how convincingly the man responds, there's no real understanding inside the room. He's simulating the outward behavior of understanding without possessing the inner content we call thinking. Now, you might relate to this with everyday tech. Think about using a navigation app that tells you exactly when to turn. The voice sounds confident, It gives you perfect instructions and you reach your destination. Do you ever stop to ask whether the app knows the city, or do you just treat it as a very effective tool? The Chinese room forces that same awkward question onto AI. Is a chatbot that crafts moving, coherent answers actually thinking, or merely following a very sophisticated rulebook? There's an emotional layer too. Imagine being the man in the room. You perform miracle after miracle, producing responses that make people outside marvel, and yet you have no idea what you're doing. That disconnect feels almost cruel. It makes you worry about the people behind the machines, or about what it means when we attribute agency to systems that might be empty inside. Searle's argument was targeted at the claim that running the right program is sufficient for a mind. If we accept the Chinese room, the implication is that syntax alone, symbol manipulation, isn't enough for semantics. Understanding requires more than correct output. It requires something like intrinsic mental states. That said, this thought experiment also pushed philosophers and AI researchers to refine their ideas. Some say the system as a whole understands, not the man. Others point to neuroscience or embodiment as missing pieces. Whatever side you land on, the Chinese room does one crucial job. It makes us uncomfortable about easy answers. It forces us to ask what we really mean by think, understand, and conscious. So when you next find yourself chatting with a polite, brilliant-sounding AI, remember the man in the room. The performance may be flawless, but is there a mind behind it, or just instructions followed to perfection? That question shapes every conversation we have about building intelligent machines. The Anthropic Principle. Think about the last time you stood under a sky so clear you could see the Milky Way spill across it. There's an odd, immediate feeling, like the universe deliberately arranged itself for that exact moment, for you to feel small and awed at once. That reaction is exactly what the Anthropic Principle toys with. Maybe the cosmos looks tuned for life, not because someone fine-tuned it, but because only in a cosmos that allows observers would anyone ever ask the question. There are two flavors of this idea. The weaker version says, simply, we shouldn't be surprised to find the universe hospitable. If it weren't, we wouldn't be here to notice. The stronger version goes further, suggesting that the universe must have properties that allow life. Without those properties, existence as we know it wouldn't happen at all. One feels almost comforting. It's like finding out your house was built with a room just big enough for you. The other can feel unnerving because it flips the cart and says maybe the why behind it isn't purpose so much as inevitability. I remember reading a tiny fact that stuck with me. If the strength of one of the fundamental forces were off by a hair, stars wouldn't fuse heavier elements, and you and I wouldn't be typing or reading these words. It's tempting to build stories out of that, a universe crafted with us in mind. But the Anthropic Principle forces a different essay on reality. It says, maybe we are the product of a cosmic filter. Out of a near infinite spread of possible universes, only a tiny slice lets observers form. We, thinking beings, naturally find ourselves in that slice. It's not that the universe is designed for us, it's that only in universes like this can questions like, why are we here, arise. That flips hope into a strange sort of humility. On one hand, the principle reconnects us to chance. It suggests that existence might be a fluke, a statistical outcome in a vast landscape of what-ifs. On the other, there's a weird poetry to the idea that the universe notices itself by producing beings capable of noticing. If consciousness is a byproduct of certain physical conditions, then awareness is the universe's mirror. We are, in a way, the cosmos recognizing its own rules. It can feel lonely, a coincidence that can reflect, or it can feel liberating, no grand plan necessary, yet meaning still arises because we give it meaning. Personally, I like the tension. The Anthropic Principle doesn't hand us answers, it hands us perspective. It reminds us that our existence is both fragile and remarkable, and that sometimes the most profound revelations come not from certainty, but from standing under that starry sky and realizing we're the ones asking the question. The death of the author. Think about a piece of art that changed you, a song that made you see a memory differently, a film that reframed how you think about someone, a line in a book that felt like it was written for you. The idea of the death of the author is exactly that moment multiplied across every piece of work. Once something is out in the world, the creator's intention no longer has the final say. The audience takes it, folds it into their life, and gives it new meaning. That feels exhilarating and a little reckless. I've experienced this personally. Years ago, I wrote a short story that, to me, was a private apology dressed as fiction. I imagined readers would notice the regret, maybe offer a quiet nod. Instead, one reader tweeted that the protagonist inspired them to leave a toxic job. Another blogged a tearful confession about a childhood they'd kept secret. I hadn't intended those responses, and yet those interpretations weren't wrong. They belonged to those readers in a concrete, meaningful way. My control over the story's truth dissolved the moment someone else read it. This loss of authorial control is both freeing and destabilizing. On the one hand, it's liberating because it means a work can live multiple lives. A painting, a poem, a film can be a mirror that reflects different things depending on who's looking. That multiplicity can make art more powerful, more democratic. It's no longer locked to a single right meaning. On the other hand, it's terrifying for creators. You realize you can't pin down what your work will mean, and that uncertainty can feel like losing ownership of something you poured yourself into. For viewers and readers, that uncertainty is intimate. When you interpret a work, you're not just decoding symbols. You're bringing in your history, pain, humor, and hope. That personal lens is valid, even if the creator would disagree. Imagine a filmmaker who intended a scene to show irony, but someone sees it as an expression of genuine grief. Both experiences are true in their own contexts. That friction between intent and reception is where conversation and culture actually happen. So what does this mean for us as creators and as consumers? For creators, maybe it's an invitation to let go a little, to accept that once your work is released, it belongs to a public conversation you can't fully control. For consumers, it's permission to claim our readings without feeling like we've misread the artist. That doesn't erase craft or history or context, but it reminds us that meaning is shared, messy, and sometimes surprising. The death of the author doesn't kill the creator's voice, it moves it into a chorus. And in that chorus, certainty gives way to possibility, which is, in its own way, a different kind of truth. The infinite monkey theorem. Think of a monkey, not because monkeys are particularly literate, but because the image is delightfully absurd, a primate randomly bashing keys on a typewriter. Now stretch that image across infinite time. Given infinite keystrokes, the theorem says, that monkey will almost surely produce every possible text. Random gibberish, your grocery list, and yes, the complete works of Shakespeare. At first it's playful, even comforting. The crazy thing about infinity is that it can turn nonsense into meaning. Chaos isn't a one-way street. Given enough opportunities, patterns re-emerge. A single random event is meaningless. An infinite number of random events eventually paints a masterpiece. That thought has a weird kind of poetry. Order rising out of pure chance. But here's the flip side that catches in the throat. If infinity makes every arrangement possible, it also makes our world possible as an accident, a one-off pattern in a vast sea of randomness. If every configuration of particles is going to happen somewhere, sometime, then the fact that we live in a stable, lawful universe might just be one lucky roll among uncountably many. A universe that looks intentionally designed could just be a particularly coherent region of a far noisier, indifferent multiverse. That's when the idea stops being cute and starts being unnerving. I remember the first time this sank in, lying awake at night thinking about how a perfectly legible sentence could arise from nonsense, then flipping the script and asking if my life could be the accidental, coherent patch in a cosmic typewriter. It felt both liberating and humbling, like discovering I was one unlikely stitch in an enormous, indifferent tapestry. Scientists and philosophers push this further with thought experiments like the Boltzmann brain, the possibility that a single self-aware mind could momentarily pop into existence with false memories purely from random fluctuations. If that's not a punch to what feels real, I don't know what is. The math doesn't lie. Infinity has strange consequences. But let me be candid. The existential chill doesn't have to erase meaning. Even if our universe is a statistical fluke, the relationships, projects, and values we build are real to us. You don't stop caring about a friend because some cosmological model suggests your memories might be improbable. We live inside the experience, not the equations. And maybe that's where the real beauty lies. In our capacity to make sense of things, to weave narratives from chaos, to treat the fragile coherence we find as worth protecting and savoring. This paradox, that randomness can produce meaning but also threaten to explain it away, forces a question we can't duck. How do we respond to a universe that may be accidental? That's what we'll explore next. Practical ways people make meaning, and why that makes a difference even if the cosmos didn't have a plan. The grandfather paradox. Imagine this. You somehow step into a time machine, dial the year, and arrive at a quiet afternoon decades before you were born. You spot a younger version of your grandfather, funny, stubborn, the source of so many family stories. Impulsively, you interfere. A small shove, a wildly miscalculated prank, or a kind suggestion that sends his life down a different path. Days later, or maybe in an instant, you realize you've erased his future children, one of whom was your parent. If your parent never existed, then you never existed. But if you never existed, how could you have gone back in time to change anything in the first place? That's the grandfather paradox, a neat, gut-level puzzle that shows how easily the idea of time travel collapses when you try to alter events that lead to your own existence. It's not just science fiction hair-splitting, it highlights a deeper problem, causal loops and contradictions. If an action in the past makes the future impossible, then that action can't happen. Yet, if it doesn't happen, the future that allowed you to travel remains intact. It's a logic trap. What makes this so relatable is that it plays on something we all feel: regret. How often do you wish you could go back and say or do something different? The grandfather paradox takes that impulse to an extreme. It forces you to confront not only the morality of changing others' lives, but the logical impossibility of erasing yourself from history. It's equal parts ethical dilemma and self-nullifying logic puzzle. Physicists and philosophers have wrestled with this for decades and come up with a few ways to dodge the contradiction. One approach is the self-consistency principle. Whatever you do in the past must be consistent with the future you came from. In other words, you might influence small details, but something always stops you from making a change that erases your own existence. It's like the universe enforcing a cosmic no-tampering rule. Another popular idea is the many worlds or branching universe solution. If you kill or prevent the existence of your grandfather, you don't erase yourself. Instead, you create a new branch of history where you were never born. You still exist in the original branch and can travel between branches, but your actions spawn a parallel timeline with different people and outcomes. It avoids the paradox, but introduces an ever-growing forest of alternate realities and the ethical question of what you owe to people in those branches. Then there's the darker possibility. Maybe time travel simply can't exist in a way that lets you interact with the past at all. Perhaps the laws of physics forbid paradoxical actions, or practical constraints make such trips impossible. That's not as romantic as fixing a mistake, but it keeps logic intact. The The grandfather paradox does more than stump time travelers. It forces us to examine causality, responsibility, and the limits of intervention. It's a reminder that even if we could reach into the past, changing the threads that made us might unravel everything. So if you're tempted to rewrite a painful family story, ask yourself, who gets to survive the edit? Next, let's look at the ways science tries to reconcile these contradictions. Can physics save time travel from philosophical collapse? Philosophical zombies. Think about the person sitting across from you right now. A friend, a partner, a stranger on the bus. They laugh at a joke, order coffee, scroll their phone. Everything about them screams inner life, moods, memories, a sense of being. Now imagine that none of that inner life exists. Their laugh is a perfectly produced pattern of muscle movements. Their thoughts are chains of processing with no one home. That's the philosophical zombie, behaviorally indistinguishable from you and me, but stripped of consciousness. This thought experiment slips under our skin because it takes away what feels most securely ours, subjective experience. It's easy to be casual about minds when you only notice behavior. But once you ask, could there be beings that act exactly like me but don't feel anything? You start to notice how little of being human is visible from the outside. If zombies are possible, even in principle, how can you be sure you're not one, or that the people you love aren't? You might instantly resist the idea. Of course I'm conscious, you think. You have moods, pain, pleasures. You know what it feels like to taste chocolate or be embarrassed. That inner what it's like is the anchor. But the zombie argument targets exactly this anchor. It asks whether the connection between physical processes and subjective feeling is necessary, or whether it could conceivably fail. If it could, then consciousness isn't just another physical fact. It's something over and above. This can feel unsettling in a personal way. I remember once lying awake, thinking about a close friend who'd become quiet after a breakup. For weeks I'd worry. Do they still feel things? Are they simply playing the part of sadness because that's what people do? Rationally, it sounds absurd. Emotionally, it's like standing at the edge of a cliff. The zombie idea exposes a raw vulnerability. We can never directly access another's experience. Our evidence is behavior, language, shared history, not the private glow of someone else's awareness. What do we do with that? Some people double down on empathy and trust. We assume others feel because social life depends on it, and we treat people as conscious. That attitude isn't just practical, it's ethical. If there's even tiny chance that a being has experiences like ours, compassion seems warranted. Others take a scientific turn. We look for neural correlates of consciousness, argue that certain brain processes reliably track subjective states, and treat those as bridging the gap. This gives comforting confidence, though it doesn't completely eliminate the conceptual possibility of zombies. There's also a quieter, more everyday response. Live as if others are conscious. We can't prove the private light of experience in another person, but we can act on the best available reasons, their stories, their reactions, their consistency with us. In relationships, that means asking, listening, responding. It means checking in rather than assuming. Even if we imagine the worst-case philosophical scenario, the habits of care are the most human answer. So the zombie question isn't just an intellectual trick, it's a mirror. It forces us to confront how much of our moral and social life rests on trusting inner lives we can't directly see. You probably can't prove you're not a zombie, but you don't have to live that way. Choosing empathy, curiosity, and accountability is the most honest and most human response to the uncertainty. Cosmic nihilism. If existential unease threw you into a spiral, cosmic nihilism takes that spiral and drops it into a galaxy. It's the idea that the universe doesn't even register our dramas. Not cruelty, not kindness. Simply indifference so complete it reads like forgetfulness. Galaxies form and fade, stars puff out, and entire civilizations can wink out without the cosmos batting an eye. The long view is a kind of erasure. The same physics that made us will, in trillions of years, erase the footprints we think matter. Picture a late night when you can't sleep. You step outside, look up, and the stars feel impossibly distant. Now imagine trying to explain your whole life to a rock orbiting a dead star. The rock would not hate you. It would not love you. It would not remember. That image, this peaceful, almost absurd indifference, is the heart of cosmic nihilism. It's not an accusation against the universe, it's a description of scale. On the timeline of cosmology, human concerns are a few heartbeats between deep breaths. That can hit like a cold wave. Maybe you've felt it, the little voice that asks, what does any of this add up to? When a relationship ends, when a project fails, or when you suddenly realize your oldest memories will eventually be unreadable to anyone. It's easy to slide into despair, imagining that if the cosmos forgets, then none of our love, grief, or work has lasting value. But notice how personal that reaction is. The sting comes because we care. The very fact that we ache at the thought of being forgotten proves we're invested in meaning. There's another side to this forgetfulness that people sometimes miss. If the universe doesn't keep a ledger, that opens a kind of freedom. You don't have to earn cosmic approval to be valuable. You're not living for some universal scoreboard. Meaning becomes something you make and hold because you choose to, not because it's stamped into the fabric of space. That doesn't make meaning any less real. On the contrary, it makes it human scale, fragile, temporary, and therefore intensely precious. How do we live with that? Start small. Make a dinner you wanted to make. Call a friend. Finish the poem, even if no one will read it in a million years. These acts matter because they matter to you, to the people you touch, to the brief chain of effects you're part of. Cosmic indifference strips away grand guarantees, but highlights immediate responsibilities to our neighbors, to our future children, to the planet while we still inhabit it. So when you feel the chill of cosmic nihilism, don't let it freeze you into inaction. Let it clear the air. If the universe won't remember us forever, that doesn't cheapen our moments. It sharpens them. We get to decide what's meaningful. And in a cosmos that forgets, the small, deliberate choices we make are the only kind of immortality that truly fits us. The Omniscience Paradox. So let's dig into a weird catch. If a being truly knows everything, and I mean everything, including what choices it will make tomorrow, next year, even the tiny impulses it thinks it's free to follow, can it ever do otherwise? This is the heart of the Omniscience Paradox, and it gets uncomfortably personal if you let it. Picture this. You wake up and find a letter you've written to your future self that describes, in exact detail, the decision you will make at lunch. It tells you what you'll order, what you'll say, even whether you'll pick up your phone. Reading it, you suddenly feel boxed in. If you decide to do something different just to prove the letter wrong, that would mean the letter was false. But if the letter was written by your future self, how could it be false? The knowledge in that letter seems to lock your freedom. Most of us have had that small, relatable version of the experience, a spoiler. You read the ending of a book or see the final score of a game, and suddenly the choices the characters make feel inevitable. You can still enjoy the ride, but the mystery is gone. Now imagine that not just a book, but your entire life came with that kind of spoiler. That's what omniscience would feel like from the inside. A life where every move is already known, not just to others, but to you. Why does knowing the future feel like imprisonment? Because knowledge and freedom start to fight. If an omniscient being truly knows it will act in a particular way, then that being cannot act otherwise without rendering its knowledge false. To change the choice would be to retroactively rewrite what it knew about the future, which destroys the premise of perfect knowledge. So perfection in knowledge seems to demand perfection in predictability. And predictability is the opposite of freedom. Some people try to sidestep the paradox. Maybe knowing the future doesn't cause it. Maybe the future is fixed by reasons, personality, and circumstances, and the being simply knows that. But that only shifts the problem. If the being's reasons and character make one action inevitable, then freedom is still limited. If the being could have acted differently, it couldn't have known otherwise beforehand. Either way, omniscience appears to collapse the wiggle room that makes choices feel like ours. That's the chilling idea. Perfect knowledge becomes perfect imprisonment. It's not a dramatic cage of bars, but an invisible certainty that turns possibility into prophecy. For anyone who cares about choice, even the tiniest everyday choice, the thought of being fully known to oneself is both fascinating and terrifying. The paradox of inquiry. That brings us to Plato's paradox of inquiry. A little brain twister that suddenly makes every search feel problematic. Plato asks, how can you look for something when you don't know what it is? If you truly don't know it, how will you recognize it when you find it? And on the flip side, if you already know what it is, why would you need to search at all? It sounds like knowledge is trapped in a loop. Either discovering is impossible, or it's pointless because you already had the answer. Think about it in everyday terms. You've lost your keys. You know what keys look like, so you can search and spot them under the couch. That's not the paradox. That's normal. Now imagine you're trying to find your calling, that vague sense of a right career or life path. Do you know what it looks like? Not really. If you don't, how will you recognize it? But if you somehow already knew what the calling is, there'd be no need to explore or experiment. Suddenly, the idea of searching for something you don't know becomes weirdly circular. Plato pushes this further with the idea of learning itself. If knowledge is something we have to find, how do we begin to search without any clue? If we already possess the knowledge inside us, learning is just remembering. That's his famous move, the theory of recollection. The idea that the soul already knows the forms, and learning is uncovering what's already there. It's clever, but it also feels a bit like saying the problem disappears by pretending the answer was always inside you. Why does this matter to us? Because we live in a culture that prizes searching for answers, identity, validation. Yet we often feel stuck wondering if our searches are meaningful. When I've faced big life choices, I've caught myself thinking both thoughts at once. I don't even know what I'm looking for, and if I knew, I wouldn't be here asking. That tension is exactly what Plato isolates. The paradox forces a choice. Either concede that genuine discovery is impossible, you can't find what you can't recognize, or accept that searching without prior knowledge is pointless. Neither is satisfying, which is why philosophers keep chewing on it. But it's also strangely reassuring. Recognizing the paradox lets us see why trial and error, analogies, mentors, and small experiments are so valuable. We may not know the perfect form of what we want, but we can create provisional targets, test them, and refine our sense of what right looks like. Plato's puzzle doesn't stop us. It tells us why the messy, iterative path of learning and living is necessary. And honestly, that's a relief. Because if true knowledge required perfect pre-knowledge, very few of us would ever start. Memento Mori. Remember that you must die. Those 3 words hit like a light in a dark room. Not an accusation, not a threat, but a clear, cold fact. I used to think that saying it out loud was morbid, a party pooper at the dinner table. But over time, it stopped feeling cruel and started feeling clarifying. Once you accept the ending, everything in the middle gets a little sharper. Think about a single minute of your day. Left to itself, a minute is anonymous. It slides by, easily lost. But now imagine you only have a handful of those minutes. Suddenly, that ordinary minute becomes precious. You notice the steam rising from a coffee cup. You listen more closely when someone laughs. The reminder of death doesn't steal joy. It reveals why joy matters. Death defines value by imposing limits. What's finite invites attention. That's the paradox. The fact that everything ends is what makes anything worth doing at all. A sunset isn't special because it exists. It's special because it won't last. A relationship gains urgency because every conversation, every silence is a finite resource. I remember the awkward last week before my grandmother died. We argued about something trivial, then she was gone. Later, every small, unresolved remark felt painfully heavy. If I could change one thing, I'd trade a few hours of stubbornness for an extra hour of listening. The point is not to live in regret, but to let the reality of endings focus us toward presence. This isn't an invitation to despair or to constant panic about wasted time. The goal is practical, to choose with intention. When I set out to write, I imagine the reader will only have so many hours to decide whether to click, read, or reply. That imaginary limit helps me cut the noise. It helps me tell the story that matters, not every story. Memento Mori is a tool for pruning, for figuring out what deserves our minutes. And yes, it's a disturbing truth. Beauty and grief are twin faces of the same coin. A child's first laugh is luminous precisely because childhood ends. A bouquet of flowers moves you because petals will fall. Holding both ideas is uncomfortable. To love is to risk losing, and to know you will lose is to risk loving less. But the alternative, numbing ourselves to avoid pain, costs a life lived under glass, where nothing is real because nothing is allowed to end. So what can you do right now with this reminder? Start small. Name 3 things today you'd miss if they were gone tomorrow, and give them 5 minutes more of undivided attention. Tell someone you appreciate them. Put down the phone and watch the light change for a minute. These are tiny habits, but they re-teach our senses to value the finite. Memento Mori isn't cruelty. It's clarity. It's the reminder that because time runs out, every ordinary minute can become a small, private miracle.